Hi everyone, it's DJ Philip Tan, and it's been a while since I made one of these videos. I haven't been completely lazy. I've actually been doing some gigs, not live in-person gigs, of course. I'm still trying to stay safe, but I've been doing a lot of virtual gigs on Zoom rooms and such. Because there's usually been a bit of a break between each one of those gigs, I've had time to sort of incorporate new technology, and hopefully when my radio show comes back in November, you'll see some of that, some new technical tricks that I've got up my sleeve. And I want to talk about my favorite DJs and why they're my favorite DJs, and a certain category of DJ, which I like to call the engineers. These are people who regularly incorporate new technology in the way how they do things, and in doing so, change the minds of how other DJs do things. Sort of they open up the possibilities of, hey, we could actually change the way how our equipment works and what we can do with our music. So let's get into that. So one thing that surprises people, especially people who are in the technology world, is how conservative DJs can be with their hardware. Even though we're surrounded by technology, a lot of our stuff is kind of old and out of date. For instance, I'm still DJing with turntables in 2020. I have a laptop over here that's from that's about 8 years old, and it's running Mac OS Sierra. I'm very, very, very hesitant to update the software, and I'm not alone in this. There are a lot of DJs out there who are still hanging on to old, outdated pieces of software because it works for them, and I get sometimes requests from DJs to help them out when they have trouble getting their old software to run on new hardware, for instance. Some of the reasons are purely economic, right? If you spend a long time accumulating a large vinyl collection, you don't want to have to spend more time and money just replacing that music with digital copies. You could rip those records yourself, but that only runs as fast as the record normally plays, and that a lot of people don't have the time to be able to do that for an extensive music collection. Or you could buy professionally encoded music off online stores, but that takes money and a little bit of time too, because you have to now you have to search like 5 different remastered versions and figure out which is the version that you want. And it takes a bit of time too, because you have to figure out which remastered version do you want, which online store has the song, which file format do you want the song to be encoded in. Is it MP3, or do you want to go for a lossless format, for instance? So DJs who already have a functional workflow don't really feel motivated to sort of break out from that and spend more money just to get back to where they already were, only on new technology, right? Secondly, DJ technology is actually notoriously finicky, and it's not because of the equipment itself, it's because of the environments that DJs have to perform in. If we're playing outdoor events, there's heat and wind. If we're playing indoor events, there's liquids and smoke, right? And so if DJs find a piece of equipment that they believe is reliable and sturdy and will last the test of time, they will tend to gravitate towards that versus a piece of technology that has all of the bells of whistles but may not necessarily have had the reputation of lasting a very long time. And typically, the more reliable equipment is the stuff that has fewer features. There's, fewer buttons for dirt to get into, for instance. All of the money has gone into over-engineering the basic components, like the motor on the turntable, or the sliders on the knobs on the mixer, or how well the cable actually connects to the back of the mixer. New features are great when you get them, but those basic criteria still need to be met first, and a lot of DJs just feel a little bit safer sticking with equipment that they already know has been tested and proven, rather than taking a chance on something that's brand new on the market. Now, DJs can be convinced to adopt new technology if they think it's going to make them a better DJ. Now, rarely is that actually true. Rarely does the technology actually make a DJ sound or perform better. But sometimes it opens up possibilities for the DJ who's willing to put in the time and the effort to practice on with a new feature, for instance. An example of that will be David Mancuso, who I've brought up a few times in this series. He was a seminal DJ in the 70s, the New York loft party scene. So these were private parties that were happening in people's personal living spaces. David Mancuso's party, which was called The Loft by its attendees, was actually in his own personal studio loft. It will have his bed and his refrigerator, and of course, a pair of turntables and 5 massive speakers on different corners of the room, plus more hanging from the ceiling. You see, what David introduced to the art of DJing was the concept of blending hi-fi technology that was coming on the market in the 70s with dance parties. Previous to him, a lot of the kinds of sound systems that you will get in a large dance environment wouldn't be all that different from public address systems. Systems that were there that would be loud enough to overpower the noise of a crowd, but not necessarily sound terribly good. They were sort of trading power for clarity. Whereas what David was trying to do was use equipment that prioritized clarity and sonic fidelity. In fact, the enduring goal of the hi-fi scene and what we will call an audiophile scene nowadays is to create that illusion that the performers of that music are actually right there in the space with you when you're listening to the music. And speakers and amplifiers were designed to try to create that illusion. And so what David did was he figured out a way how to take this equipment that had really been designed for home use and combine it in such a way that it will work for 100 people, 200 people, and to give them an experience that they previously would not have been able to hear at a club or in a home. It was a whole brand new experience, and it ushered in this new era of what we now know as disco. But at that time, it was funk and African jazz and Latin music and experimental electronic music. It was much more eclectic than what a lot of people think of disco nowadays. This actually changed the way how many DJs, especially New York DJs, thought about their goals as a DJ. So the sound quality of music being played for a public dance environment really wasn't a priority until David Mancuso showed how a higher quality reproduction of that music could lead to a more exciting, transcendent experience for the audience. And in fact, he achieved that by eschewing some of the technology that was available for DJs in the 60s, such as crossfaders, for instance. He could only play one record at a time, even though he could sort of prepare a second record on a turntable. He had to do a hard switch from one to the other, and he did that so that he wouldn't have to compromise on sound quality. It was a hard switch rather than having two sources being played and blended in real time. And then he picked music that will sound great for that style of DJing. So music with great intros and great outros, where you want to hear the whole song rather than have it blend into the next song. That all changed as disco evolved, of course, because other DJs did the whole blending thing where, you don't really hear the end of one song, you don't really hear the beginning of a song, they all become just one long medley. But David actually tried to incorporate that into his own parties, but he found that it compromised the sound quality to the extent that he wasn't happy with. And so he actually switched back. And I think that's a sign of a good engineer DJ, is someone who's willing to try and to assess new technology on its merits and compare it to what previous technology had yielded him. On the other hand, he wasn't happy with the speakers that he started with, even though they were already much higher quality than you'd find in any discotheque in the 70s in New York. He would modify them, and he'd work with professional audio installers such as Alex Rosner, who outfitted very much of his sound system. As an example, one of his favorite speakers is the Klipschorn, which is this massive home speaker that was built by the Klipsch Corporation. And he'd actually disassemble it so that the high frequency section will be lifted up high above the heads of everybody, so that their bodies wouldn't be absorbing that high frequency. Everybody would be roughly about the same distance from the high frequencies, whereas the low frequencies would sit on the floor where they would get some acoustic reinforcement by being on that solid surface. The low frequencies, what we call the woofers of the speaker, typically work most efficiently if you tuck them up into a corner of the room, Whereas the high frequencies tend to sound best if they're not tucked up in the corner of the room. So how do you balance the two? He built artificial walls just for the woofers. So this weird V-shaped chunks of heavy wood that he will place right behind each woofer that was actually somewhere in the middle of the room. And that gave him the best of both worlds. And the high frequencies were where he needed them. The low frequencies got the power that he needed. He would actually get additional high frequency speakers called tweeter arrays designed and installed way above everybody's heads, going outwards. So they weren't pointing at anyone, they were just kind of bouncing off the ceiling, so that you kind of have this high frequency sparkle, the shimmer that you get from cymbals and tambourines, sort of like falling on you like raindrops. And it was such an amazing sound effect that that discotheques would start to incorporate that all the way until, I would say, the 90s, and maybe even today there are a few places that still use high-frequency tweeter arrays. What David managed to do was basically create a showroom for high-quality reproduction of dance music. And in doing so, he cultivated both the market and as well as place where expertise in high-quality reproduction of dance music could grow. And I strongly believe that without what David Mancuso did in the 70s in New York, disco music wouldn't sound as lush and as rich as it does. If you listen to it today, you're still stunned by the production value and that went into the production of those records. And of course, taste changed in the 80s when new electronic equipment comes on the market and the old disco formula gets a little bit overplayed and worn out. But David Mancuso keeps with the times. He quite happily incorporated well-produced electronic music, for instance, inside his repertoire, and again created a taste for people who really wanted to hear the new experimental stuff being played out of a really high-quality sound system. A side note, I've mentioned that all my favorite DJs check multiple boxes. There's multiple reasons why they're my favorite DJ. And Mancuso's engineering approach, but also the way that he selected and found new music, the way how he worked with his community to be able to sort of build a taste for the music that he was selecting, and the way how he shared his thoughts and his techniques about how to create a really high fidelity listening experience for a dance crowd. All of these things are the reason why I have such respect for David Mancuso. The next DJ I want to highlight is possibly my favorite DJ of all time. And again, he checks off multiple boxes. He is an amazing music selector. He's probably best known for his performance ability. He's continuing to build communities even though everyone's locked down in their houses right now. But I do want to talk about the engineering mentality of DJ Jazzy Jeff. Jazzy Jeff, of course, is half of DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. That's, of course, how I first heard of him. And he comes from Philadelphia and grew up in the Philadelphia DJ scene. Very much turntables and a crossfader, right? With MC on the microphone, Will Smith. So here's a story about DJ Jazzy Jeff. He shows up at an equipment manufacturer with a pile of broken mixers. The manufacturer is Gemini, and they make a mixer called the MX2200. It's not a high-end mixer, but it does have a crossfader, so that if you move it to one side, you hear one turntable, you move it to the other side, you hear the other turntable. And Jazzy Jeff brings them to the headquarters so that they can be fixed up and serviced. Gemini is wondering how did all these mixers break in the first place, and he explains to them his transformer technique that was pretty popular in Philadelphia at the time, where by moving a record pretty slowly but moving the crossfader extremely quickly, you can sort of break it up into several rapid chunks. It sounds like the transformer sound effect that you get from TV cartoons. And so Gemini was happy to have a star like Jazzy Jeff using their products so extensively that they actually re-released that same mixer, the PMX 2200, with Jazzy Jeff's signature on it. However, what they hadn't realized was that Jazzy Jeff liked the MX2200 not because of its features, but because of a bug. You see, a crossfader, when you move it from left to right or right to left, is supposed to smoothly blend from one record to the other. But there was actually a problem in the design of the MX2200. So if you just moved it slightly, you will hear both turntables playing at full volume. You had to move it all the way to one side, all the way to the other side to cut out the turntable, and otherwise it would just play both turntables at full volume. This is actually terrible for disco mixing. It's perfect for scratch mixing, especially for the transformer technique that Jazzy Jeff popularized. So when they re-released the mixer, that's the PMX2200 with Jazzy Jeff's signature on it, they accidentally fixed the problem and made it smoothly blend from one to the other. So as a sad result, the first mixer that had Jazzy Jeff's name on it is actually a terrible scratch mixer. But that's not a knock on Jazzy Jeff himself. One thing that he's proved consistently over and over and over again is that when new technology comes on the market, he's willing to give it a try and to put in the time, most importantly, to get good at it and to fairly assess its strengths and its faults. A lot of Jazzy Jeff's reputation is built on being a scratch DJ. And so his image is of him with two platters of vinyl frantically moving his hands. He understands this. That's part of the reason why people go and see his shows. He made the transition to DJing with a laptop pretty quickly once he realized that it would allow him to travel internationally with his music a lot easier than carrying crates of records, right? Those things are extremely valuable, they're extremely heavy. Whatever money you're going to make on the show, you're going to lose in paying the overage charges and carrying heavy luggage. So the laptop solved that problem for him. But most recently, he'd been looking at technologies that will allow him to scratch on a record without using needles. And it's kind of interesting if you look at this picture that I've put up of him, all of the different kinds of turntable-like equipment that's behind him, all of the different options that he's assessed, different kinds of turntables, different kinds of needles, turntables that are actually digital controllers, so they actually just detect the position of the record without using a tonam at all. And even accelerometer-based systems where you actually put an accelerometer on top of the record and it detects where that record is facing at any given time. What always stuns me is that every time he performs with any of these technologies, it looks like he's been living with that technology all his life. He's so fluent, it sounds perfect, he looks completely comfortable with it. And I know that didn't come naturally. I know that came from hours and hours and days of practice. But he's willing to give any new technology that shot. He was one of the first high-profile DJs that I'd heard of who actually got COVID-19, and thankfully he recovered from it. He seems to be using that experience in a sort of a renewed effort to grow an online community and to encourage people to stay at home by basically giving them free Jazzy Jeff shows through live streaming. The way how he's incorporated new streaming technologies and new mobile phone apps into the experience of how he's presenting these shows, it's not intimidating, it's very welcoming, it's always changing. And so he's very experimental when it comes to new technologies, and he'll try it out, he'll give it a fair shot, he'll try to work out the kinks of it. But he's not overly married to any of these technologies. It's like if he finds something better or if something new doesn't work out for him, he'll just switch. That kind of flexibility, I think, is incredibly admirable. Unlike so many other DJs who are unwilling to update the operating system on their computer, he's willing to take the risk of new technology breaking on him, investing tons of time in something that he's unfamiliar with, just to get good at it, so that he can reap all of the benefits that software designers and equipment manufacturers and tinkerers can imagine. And in doing so, he inspires DJs like me to look at what he's doing and think, how can I shake up my setup so that I can give a better performance, whether that's live or in a virtual Zoom room, right? So those are two of the DJs that I wanted to talk about, David Mancuso and DJ Jazzy Jeff. And in my next video, I'll talk about more of my favorite DJs. Thanks.